Rain struck the coaching yard in slanting sheets and turned the packed earth to a dark, sucking mire that clung to Eleanor Anderson's shoes with every small shift of weight. Dawn had not yet broken cleanly. The sky was a bruised grey lid over Bath, and the lamps outside the inn smoked in the wet wind as though the morning itself refused to arrive. She stood beside Lady Anderson's carriage with both hands locked around a hat box she was not permitted to open, much less wear, while water crept through the seam of her left sole and settled cold against her stocking. Her fingers had gone first from numb to aching, and then to a sharp, needling pain that made the joints feel split. Yet she didn't move them. If she shifted, the box slipped. If the box slipped, Lady Anderson would call her careless in front of the driver and footman, and any stranger close enough to listen. Her cloak was wool once thick enough for winter roads, but the hem was frayed and the shoulders had thinned where years of rain had bitten into the weave. Dark hair, pinned in haste by hands too stiff from cold to be careful, had already loosened against her temples. Wet strands clung to her skin. She kept her eyes lowered because that was easier than meeting the expressions around her. Curiosity from the ostlers, contempt from two women under a shared umbrella, and that particular polite confusion from travellers who could not decide whether she was a servant dressed above her station or a lady dressed beneath it. Her stomach had been empty since yesterday's noon meal. A crust and a thin strip of cheese eaten standing behind the stable wall where the cook would not see, and hunger had become a steady, private burn under her ribs, as familiar now as breath. A porter came through the gate with a crate on his shoulder and slowed when he saw her still standing in the rain. He glanced at the carriage crest, then at Eleanor's face, then at the hat box, and his mouth pressed into a line that might have been pity had he dared offer it. No one offered pity where Lady Anderson's name could travel. A shop boy from the apothecary ran past with parcels wrapped in oilcloth and nearly slid on the cobbles. He righted himself with a gasp, looked at Eleanor's bare, reddened hands gripping the lacquered box, and stared half a heartbeat too long. She lowered her chin further as though modesty might turn observation into invisibility. It never had. In every inn yard between Bristol and Bath she had been seen carrying trunks, seen counting coin she did not keep, seen taking rebuke for delayed wheels and cold soup and roads, washed out by storms she did not command. Merchants had asked, with the guarded boldness reserved for those just outside a family's confidence, "Miss, shall the charge be entered under your name?" And, "Miss, is there no groom to haul that?" And once, in Wells, an old landlord with a red nose and kind eyes had said softly, "You are Mr. Anderson's daughter, are you not?" She had answered all of them the same way, brief, precise, with no room for sympathy. The account went to Lady Anderson. The luggage belonged to Lady Anderson. The delay was regretted. She had learned that speech could be armour if it remained formal and thin. What she could not armour was her body. Her shoulders burned from yesterday's loads. The skin across her knuckles had cracked where wet rope had rubbed when she helped fasten a trunk after a strap snapped. Her throat was dry despite the rain, and each swallow scratched. When the wind shifted, it brought the smell of oats, horse sweat, wet leather, and coffee drifting from the taproom. Coffee for travellers with coins, warmth for those invited inside. By the third week of March, she had stopped counting how often she crossed a town on foot while her stepmother rode behind glass. Bath was only the latest stage in a long choreography of humiliation that looked accidental to strangers and deliberate to anyone who knew the Anderson household. Lady Anderson preferred command delivered in a low voice that made disobedience feel like sacrilege. Eleanor was sent ahead to settle accounts, sent behind to fetch parcels, sent through rain with messages that could have waited an hour, sent without breakfast because a young woman who is useful does not require indulgence. Her stepsisters, Clara and Imogen, travelled with lap rugs over their knees and laughed at shop windows and perfume bottles, while Eleanor stood outside with purchases stacked to her chin. She had once possessed a blue riding cloak lined in fur and gloves stitched to her wrists by her mother's own maid. Those had vanished into Clara's wardrobe in the first winter after the funeral. She had once eaten at her father's right hand in the small dining room with the painted seascape and the brass clock that lost 3 minutes each day. That room belonged now to guests. She took her meals, when there were meals, in the passage by the kitchen door, where draughts came under the stones, and the servants hurried past without stopping because kindness could cost employment. Her father had died of fever in late autumn, hot 1 hour and silent by morning, and the shipping accounts he left behind had opened like rotten timber under pressure. Debt had moved through the house faster than grief. Men with ledgers arrived. Locks changed. Silver departed in wrapped bundles. Her mother was already in the churchyard by then, gone years earlier with a cough that took her voice before it took her breath, and there was no one left to stand between Eleanor and Lady Anderson's economy of small punishments. The attic room where Eleanor slept had one narrow window that rattled in wind, and a mattress thin enough to remember every board beneath it. Even there she kept one private dignity hidden under a loose floor plank. 3 books her father had taught her to read aloud from when she was small, pages foxed, margins marked in his square hand. She touched them at night as though touching a pulse. The inn door opened with a burst of lamplight and steam. Lady Anderson stepped out first, silk skirts lifted clear of the mud by a maid who bent too low to keep the hem dry. Lavender entered the yard before Lady Anderson did. It moved through rain and dung and smoke as insistently as her voice moved through a room. She wore pearl drops at her ears despite the weather and a travelling mantle trimmed in sable that made her look larger, warmer, indisputably in command. Clara followed in pale green wool, Imogen in plum, both gloved, both dry, both pretending not to see Eleanor except to assess whether she had failed at anything visible. "Why are you standing like a post?" Lady Anderson asked. Not loud, not kind. "The driver has been waiting." Eleanor shifted the hat box to her left arm and reached for the carriage step, her palms slipping once on wet brass. She steadied herself before anyone could say clumsy. "Forgive me, Lady Anderson." The wheel sank in the rut. "I asked Tom to fetch a plank." Tom, old enough to be her grandfather, stood nearby with rain in his beard and eyes fixed on the horses. He did not contradict her. "Do not offer explanations," Lady Anderson said. "Offer competence." Clara gave a small laugh and drew her muff tighter. Imogen looked Eleanor over in that bright, sharp way that sought weakness like a needle seeks cloth. "Her hair is loose again," she said. "If she must stand beside us, she could at least not look like a drowned crow." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. She set the step in place. She took the parcel from Imogen's hand. She bowed her head the exact degree required, and no more. In the same motion she caught the brief flash of her reflection in the carriage glass. Thin face, rain-chafed skin, dark eyes too large in hollows carved by sleeplessness. Plain, they called her. Plain was useful. Plain could be ignored until labour was required. A pair of gentlemen waiting under the awning watched as Lady Anderson handed Eleanor a folded account slip and pointed toward the far lane where the chandlery stood. "Run this to Mr. Peake," Lady Anderson said. "If he disputes the sum, remind him his stock was inferior. Then call at the pastry shop for the sugared almonds Clara prefers, and mind that you do not bruise them as you did in Frome. We depart in 20 minutes. 20 minutes for 2 errands on slick stones 1/4 mile apart, with lanes clogged by carts and rain. Eleanor inclined her head. "Yes, Lady Anderson." One of the gentlemen, younger, with a fashionable cravat and boots that had never met real mud, said to his companion, in a voice not low enough, "I had thought Anderson left but one daughter worth naming." The older man gave a small sound that might have been warning or agreement. Eleanor stepped away before their eyes could sharpen further. She moved quickly, shoes filling, hem heavy, hat-box tucked under one arm, because Lady Anderson had not released her from guarding it, and because disobedience had a memory in that household that lasted longer than kindness. "At the chandlery, mister." Peake argued exactly as predicted, insulted Lady Anderson's steward, then glanced at Eleanor's face and softened by 1 degree when he saw she was shaking from cold. He shaved 6 pence from the disputed total, wrote a receipt and pressed it into her damp hand. "You should be inside, miss," she answered. "I am where I am sent," and left before gratitude could undo her voice. At the pastry shop, the girl behind the counter wrapped the almonds in blue paper and added 2 broken biscuits with a furtive look toward the door. "For the road," she whispered. Eleanor hesitated only long enough to understand the gift, then nodded once and slipped the biscuits into her sleeve. Food was contraband when kindness gave it. When she returned, breath cutting in her chest, the carriage was loaded and Lady Anderson was already seated. Rain ran from Eleanor's lashes as she offered up the receipts, each one unfolded and precise. Lady Anderson did not thank her. She inspected the figures, handed one to Clara, and said, "You took too long." Eleanor tasted blood where she had bitten her lip while running, and said nothing. Silence was cheaper than protest. Imogen leaned toward the window, her perfume sweet and cloying, and tapped the hat box with one gloved finger. "Do not drop that, Eleanor. It contains what little elegance this journey possesses." The footman reached as if to relieve her of it, then paused at Lady Anderson's slight shake of the head. Eleanor remained standing in the rain beside the wheel as the others settled into cushions and blankets. The driver clicked his tongue to the team. The carriage lurched forward a foot, then stopped when Lady Anderson rapped the roof and lowered the window again. "You will walk to the Crescent and meet us there," she said. "The roads are crowded. I will not have mud on the step from your shoes." The window shut. The carriage moved. Eleanor stood a moment with rain running down her neck and the hat box heavy against her ribs, then turned toward the long curve of road climbing into the pale, unfriendly morning. She had once believed grief could keep a person warm, as if memory itself were a coal one might cup in both hands. She had grieved for her father until tears brought headaches. She had grieved for her mother until the sound of her own name felt borrowed. She had grieved in a quieter and more shameful chamber of her heart for Julian Ashford, Duke of Blackthorn, after rumours said his ship had gone down in winter seas and no survivors were found. 2 years had passed. Hunger had done what time began. Hunger and labour and the daily arithmetic of survival had thinned grief to thread. She no longer waited for rescue from titles, from old alliances, or from heaven. She shifted the hat box to her other arm and walked, because walking was what remained when hope had been spent. She turned into the incline toward the Crescent, with rain striking her cheeks hard enough to sting, one arm cramped around the hat box, and the other clamped across her middle to quiet the hollow ache there. Carts rolled past and threw grey water at her skirt. A milk wagon splashed her to the knee. 2 apprentice boys in aprons glanced back at her twice, first at the crest on the hat box, then at her shoes, as if trying to reconcile rank with ruin and failing. She kept her pace measured because haste on slick stone meant a fall, and a fall with Lady Anderson's lacquered box would cost more than skin. The biscuits in her sleeve pressed warm against her wrist from the heat of her blood, the only small mercy in a morning built to strip a person down to obedience. She could have eaten one while she walked. She did not. If she began too early, hunger would sharpen and become a blade instead of a dull, manageable weight. She had learned to bargain with her body in small increments. 10 more streets, then half a biscuit, another turn, then the rest. That was how she managed winter days in a house where meals were granted according to mood, where a full plate for Clara could mean weak broth for Eleanor, where Lady Anderson could look at a loaf and call it extravagance if Eleanor reached for a second slice. The world did not see that arithmetic. The world saw only a young woman in a wet cloak carrying what she did not own. As she crossed Gay Street, the rain thinned to a fine needling mist that found the gap at her collar and ran down her spine. Shop windows brightened by degrees. Candles were being snuffed as morning strengthened. A butcher's boy swept pink sawdust from his threshold. A maid beat dust from a hallway runner and watched Eleanor from under her cap with open, startled pity. That expression followed her often in market lanes and coaching yards, and she had come to hate it almost as much as contempt. Contempt at least recognised structure. Pity suggested a world in which rescue might be offered and accepted, and she had no practice in either. Her father had taught her accounts at the library table with the blue baize cloth, taught her how freight moved by season and tide, how a delayed shipment in November rippled into wages in January. He had pressed a blunt pencil into her hand and said, when she was 12 and solemn with concentration, "Figures can be cruel, Nell, but they are honest. Men are less reliable. Learn the difference and you will not be cheated easily." She had believed him because he smelled of salt and cedar and rain-dried wool, and because he kissed her brow each night whether she had done well or poorly. In those years before fever and creditors and second marriages made the corridors colder, she had moved through Anderson House as if she belonged to it. The stair-runners were thick then. The silver stayed polished because there was staff enough to polish it. Her mother's laughter carried from the morning room when the pianoforte was tuned and the windows were open to summer. Now the pianoforte sat locked. Dust lay in the carved grooves. Her mother's portrait had been moved from the drawing-room to an upstairs passage where no guest would ask her name. By the first week of April, after her father's death, Lady Anderson had taken the keys to every cupboard and linen press and called it prudent household management. Eleanor remembered the sound clearly. A ring of keys striking mahogany as Lady Anderson set them down during supper and smiled over the rim of her wineglass as if they were jewellery newly gifted. "We must be practical," she had said to the rector's wife, to Clara, to Imogen, to the room at large. Mr. Anderson left obligations, not security. Practical had meant dismissing half the staff, then assigning their work downward. Practical had meant reducing candles upstairs and telling Eleanor that reading after dark harmed the eyes in any case. Practical had meant taking her mother's fur-lined cloak for alteration, then letting Clara wear it to a winter musicale without alteration at all. The first time Eleanor had asked for its return, Lady Anderson had looked almost amused. "You no longer receive callers, my dear. Why should you require fur?" The second time Imogen had answered for her mother. "You are taller in the shoulder than Clara. It sits better on her." That had been untrue. So had many things that hardened into household law because they were spoken with confidence. The blue riding cloak vanished. Her kid gloves vanished. Her mother's cameo kept in a velvet pouch at the back of a drawer vanished between one Sunday and the next. Eleanor found the empty pouch and understood, with a steadiness that frightened her, that theft from her would never be named theft so long as Lady Anderson chose the language. She reached the corner by the bookseller and paused under the shallow awning to shift the hat box before her fingers failed entirely. The bookseller's display held a new volume of sermons, 2 atlases, and a second-hand copy of Cowper with a torn spine. She looked at the pages the way hungry men looked at bakery glass. Literacy had been her private inheritance when every visible inheritance was contested. Her father had read to her through winter storms while shutters rattled and the fire snapped low. He had let her sit in his chair, feet not touching the floor, and correct his arithmetic for sport. After his burial, when black crape still hung at the front door, and callers still lowered their voices in corridors, Lady Anderson had suggested the library be closed, except on Thursdays to prevent waste of coal. Within a month, the lock was changed. Eleanor kept 3 books under a loose board in the attic and read by stolen candle ends. She never told anyone she still copied lines in a narrow notebook hidden inside her mattress ticking, because words were the one thing Lady Anderson could not auction by lot. Once, in January, she had been found half asleep over that notebook with ink on her cuff. Lady Anderson had turned the page with one gloved finger, read 2 lines aloud in a clear, mocking voice, and then held the paper to the fire until the edges blackened and curled. "A servant with literary ambitions," she had said. "How modern!" Clara had laughed. Imogen had asked if she might keep the silver pen holder from Eleanor's desk, since Eleanor clearly had no proper use for it. By spring, the desk itself was in Imogen's bedchamber beside a new mirror. The mirror had belonged to Eleanor's mother. She left the awning and resumed her climb. The city grew grander by degrees, facades cleaner, windows broader, stone brighter where wealth paid to scrub smoke away. Her wet hem slapped at her ankles. The hatbox handle cut a groove into her palm. She counted breaths as if they were coins, and she was short by 10. Debt had been discussed over her head at first, in closed rooms with ledgers spread like maps of a battlefield already lost. Then it became a public language. Men arrived with notices and polite bows and eyes that slid past Eleanor as if she were furniture. Lady Anderson spoke to them in the drawing room with tea service laid out, her voice smooth, her figures prepared, her distress curated. She always positioned herself as steward of a collapsed estate. She never mentioned the new carriage purchased 3 months after the funeral. She did not mention Clara's trousseau lace or Imogen's French ribbons, only the burdens she carried and the sacrifices she claimed to make. Eleanor had once asked to review the shipping ledgers her father kept, not from defiance but from competence. Lady Anderson refused with a smile that did not warm her face. "Accounts are not for unmarried women without prospects," she said. "Your duty is domestic, not financial." A week later, Eleanor discovered that her allowance had been suspended until circumstances improved. Circumstances improved for everyone except her. She was given lists of household economies to enforce against cooks and maids, then blamed when those economies displeased Lady Anderson's table. She sold her own hair ribbons to purchase writing paper for the steward, because the steward claimed there was no budget for extra supplies. She went without meat for 3 days so Clara could host friends for tea with sugared cakes. She told herself it was temporary. Then she stopped telling herself anything at all. At the top of Brock Street, the wind came hard around the curve and nearly took her hood. She caught it with her wrist, jostled the hatbox, and steadied both with a sharp breath. Ahead, the honey-coloured sweep of the Royal Crescent emerged through mist, proud and indifferent, windows catching what little light the morning offered. Carriages lined the curb in orderly intervals. Footmen in good livery waited under canopies, while ladies descended with gloved hands and dry hems. Eleanor felt the old split inside her open again, the one between education and station. between what she could discuss and where she could stand. She knew the names of ports in Lisbon and Antwerp, knew how marine insurance was priced in bad weather years, knew enough French to read correspondence without assistance. She also knew how to carry coal up 3 flights quietly so Clara could sleep late, knew how to remove candle wax from lace without leaving a mark, knew that if Lady Anderson's bell rang twice in quick succession, it meant accusation was coming, and witnesses were already in the room. Cruelty in that house was rarely theatrical. It was administrative. It arrived as instruction, as correction, as a mission. A plate removed. A fire left unlit in her room by mistake. A guest introduced to Clara and Imogen as the daughters of the house while Eleanor stood 2 paces behind with the tea tray and no name at all. 3 days earlier, in a posting inn outside Bradford-on-Avon, Lady Anderson had called her to the private parlour after supper. The candles were low and Clara was darning a glove she would discard by month's end. Imogen sorted ribbons by colour and did not look up. Lady Anderson held a letter open and tapped it against her palm. "You will understand," she said, "that with creditors increasingly impatient, I cannot continue to carry dead weight. If an offer comes for a companion position in Devon, you will accept it without dramatics. You are 22. No dowry, no connection worth noting. Gratitude would become you." Eleanor had stood with her hands clasped behind her back to hide that they were shaking. "I am already in your service, Lady Anderson." The words had come out level, and that had been its own danger. Lady Anderson's gaze sharpened. "Do not be clever when you are dependent." Clara looked up then, smile small and bright. "Devon might suit her. Sea air for that complexion." Imogen asked whether Eleanor might leave her plain winter shawl behind if she went, because it could be cut into wrappers for kitchen jars. Eleanor had inclined her head and left before her face betrayed anything. In the corridor, out of their sight, she pressed her thumb hard into her own palm until pain returned her to herself. By dawn, she had packed nothing. She owned almost nothing to pack. Now she stepped onto the crescent pavement and saw Lady Anderson's carriage waiting where she had been ordered to meet it, lacquer gleaming wet, crest unmarred by weather. The driver looked straight ahead. The footman did not reach for the hat box. Through the misted glass she could make out Clara's pale profile and Imogen's hat plume. Both turned toward each other in easy conversation, while Eleanor stood alone in the rain, breathing through hunger, through memory, through the old lesson that survival came one command at a time. She drew the biscuits from her sleeve, broke one in half with careful fingers, and ate without lifting her eyes to the window. She swallowed the second bite too quickly, coughed once behind her fist, and heard the first crack of disaster from the lower curve of the crescent. It was a sharp wooden report, like timber split by frost. Then a horse screamed. The sound climbed the stone facades and came back doubled. Heads turned in a single startled motion along the pavement. A groom dropped a valise. A lady on the opposite side gave a small cry and backed into her footman. Eleanor looked down the slope and saw a dark travelling carriage fishtail on slick cobbles where the rain had left a glassy skin. One wheel struck the corner of a brewer's dray. Spokes snapped. The axle pitched. The team lurched sideways, harness chains jerking bright and hard. The carriage struck the curb and rolled once, with a grinding crash of lacquer and iron. The world moved all at once and then in fragments. One horse went down on its knees and thrashed, eyes white. Steam rose from both animals in the cold rain. A trunk burst from the rear lashings and skidded, lid flung open, shirts and papers dragging through street water. A man in a torn greatcoat was thrown clear and hit the stone's shoulder first, then head, hard enough that Eleanor felt the impact in her own teeth. No one ran to him. The crowd recoiled from hooves and rank with equal instinct. Men stepped back under awnings. 2 coachmen shouted contradictory orders. Someone yelled for a surgeon. Someone else shouted not to touch the fallen passenger until he was named. Lady Anderson's carriage window dropped with a snap. "Do not move," she called, voice low but cutting through the din. "Eleanor, stand exactly where you are." Eleanor had already set the hatbox down against the nearest column. She was in the street before the command finished leaving Lady Anderson's mouth. Rain slapped her face as she crossed the stones, skirts dragging heavy at her calves. A wheel rolled loose past her and struck a post. She slid once on mud, steadied, and reached the fallen man as a groom finally dared approach the horses. He lay on his side, rain darkening his hair to near black, greatcoat ripped at the shoulder seam, one gloved hand half curled against the ground. Blood ran from a cut at his brow, thin and bright, and threaded toward his temple. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, rough. He smelled of wet wool, leather, and distant salt. "Kettle Row surgeon!" a bystander shouted. "Send for Kettle Row!" "No one touch his grace!" another voice said from behind her, strained and uncertain. "By God, do you hear me?" "His grace." The words landed after her knees had already hit stone. Eleanor slid her hand beneath the man's head to keep it from the gutter and looked up at the nearest onlooker, a middle-aged clerk with a dripping hat and frightened eyes. "Then fetch the surgeon instead of speaking," she said. "Now!" The clerk stared at her, then ran. She tore the wet biscuit paper from her hand and pressed it aside, then reached for her hem. Thread pulled. Fabric resisted. She yanked harder and ripped a long strip from the petticoat under her skirt, fingers shaking from cold and urgency, both. The man's lashes twitched. She folded cloth once, twice, and pressed it against his brow. His eyes opened, storm grey, clear despite pain, fixed on her face with immediate, hostile focus. "Do not touch me!" His voice was low, harshened by impact and travel, and still unmistakably accustomed to obedience. Eleanor held the cloth in place and did not move her hand. Rain ran down her wrist and under his collar. "Then do not bleed, your grace." His gaze sharpened, not at her words first, at her hand, at the split skin over her knuckles, at the bruise shadowing her wrist where her sleeve had fallen back. His jaw tightened. "Who are you?" She almost answered with the practiced lie Lady Anderson preferred. Companion, dependent, useful burden. Instead, she heard her own voice, raw with breathlessness and cold. "Eleanor Anderson." Recognition flashed so quickly she might have mistaken it for pain. Then he blinked once, hard, as if clearing water from his sight. She knew that face even with rain and blood, and 2 missing years carved into it. The line of the mouth had grown more severe. One pale scar ran from the edge of his left ear into his hairline, but no rumour could disguise him from memory. Julian Ashford, Duke of Blackthorn, alive. For 2 years she had heard versions of his death in drawing rooms and kitchens and church porches, lost with his vessel in winter seas, taken by fever in Lisbon, detained abroad by war. Each retelling confident, each contradictory. She had believed the one that asked least of hope. Now he lay half in the gutter, breathing through clenched teeth, and the world she trusted to remain cruelly predictable shifted under her knees. A young footman in torn livery reached them at last, face ashen. "Your Grace." Julian did not look away from Eleanor. "Quiet." The footman closed his mouth. By the time the second church bell struck the quarter, 3 more men had formed a loose ring around the wreck, useless with alarm and too careful of hierarchy to act without direction. Eleanor kept pressure on the wound and counted his breaths. 8, 9, 10. His gloved hand moved, searching for leverage, and she caught his wrist before he could push himself upright. "Do not," she said. "Your head struck stone." His expression went colder. "You are issuing me orders in a public street." "You may dismiss me when you can stand." For one suspended moment she thought he might argue out of pure habit. Then he stilled. Rain slid from his lashes. His eyes remained on her face as if he were reading figures in poor light. "You are thinner," he said. The words were so abrupt they felt indecent. She kept her voice flat. "You have been absent, Your Grace. You are shaking. It is raining. You are hungry." Heat flared in her cheeks despite the cold. "This is neither the hour nor the subject." His mouth shifted by a fraction. Not warmth, not quite contempt. Assessment. "Liar!" The cloth at his brow was soaked through. She reached for a cleaner fold. He caught her wrist, not hard, but with enough force to stop her movement. His fingers were cold from rain, strong despite the fall. "Who put that bruise there?" "No one whose name will help you." "Answer." "Release my hand." He did at once, and that was almost more startling than the grip. Boots struck stone behind her in quick, expensive steps. Lavender came with them, bright against rain and horse sweat. Lady Anderson appeared at the edge of the crowd in sable-trimmed mantle, Clara and Imogen behind her, under a servant's umbrella, both pale with excitement rather than fear. Lady Anderson took in the scene in one sweep: overturned carriage, gathered witnesses, Eleanor kneeling in torn skirts with blood on her fingers, and the man on the ground whose signet and bearing named him before any servant could. Her expression changed with practised speed. Alarm, concern, social grace sharpened to a blade. "Your Grace," she said, sinking into a curtsy deep enough to signal deference without surrender. "What a dreadful shock! My poor daughter has clearly overstepped in her confusion. Eleanor, stand up at once! You are making a spectacle!" Eleanor did not rise. Julian's eyes moved past her shoulder to Lady Anderson. The temperature in his face dropped another degree. Lady Anderson continued, voice smooth for the listeners nearest. "She is emotional and not always reliable under strain. Permit my footman to tend you. Eleanor, you will come here immediately." Eleanor heard the command she had obeyed 1,000 times, and felt with strange clarity how little strength it held in this street against the weight of the man beneath her hand. She kept pressure on the wound and said, "The surgeon is on his way." Lady Anderson's smile tightened. "Did I ask for your opinion?" Julian spoke without raising his voice. "No one asked for yours either." Silence rippled outward from those words. Clara looked at Imogen, startled. Imogen's lips parted, then closed. A coachman near the curb removed his hat. Lady Anderson recovered quickly. "Your Grace, you do not know the circumstances. That girl has been a burden upon my household since my husband's death. She has a habit of placing herself where she is not wanted. If anything is missing from your effects, I beg you search her before she leaves this street." The accusation hit like cold metal. Eleanor felt it in her stomach before her mind formed the shape of it. Thief, in front of half the crescent, predictable, efficient, public. Julian's gaze cut back to Eleanor, then down to the hat box she had abandoned near the column, lacquer beaded with rain. Blackthorn crest and Anderson dependents standing 10 paces apart, like evidence awaiting a verdict. His voice went flat as the slate. "What is in that box?" "Lady Anderson's property," Eleanor said. Lady Anderson answered over her. "Trifles, nothing of consequence. Eleanor has been careless with it all morning." Julian looked at her until Lady Anderson fell silent of her own accord. Then he addressed Eleanor again. "Did you open it?" "No." "Were you ordered not to?" "Yes." "By whom?" "By Lady Anderson." One of Julian's men, older, with salt at his temples and mud to his knees, pushed through the ring carrying a travelling medical case. A surgeon followed, breathless, coat unbuttoned. "Your Grace, forgive the delay." Julian lifted one hand a fraction, and the apologies stopped. The surgeon knelt opposite Eleanor and reached for the compress. "Miss, if you please." She moved back just enough for him to take over. Cold struck her palms at once, where warmth and blood had been. Her torn petticoat clung to her shins. She became aware with sick precision of every eye on her. Shopkeepers, servants, ladies under shelter, men pretending not to stare and failing. The surgeon cleaned the wound quickly and pronounced it shallow. No skull fracture obvious, though rest was required. Julian ignored the recommendation before it finished. He sat up with controlled slowness, accepted no offered arm, and gained his feet in one motion that made two nearby footmen step back on instinct. Rain ran from the brim of his ruined hatless headcoat. He stood very tall despite the sway he masked. Only when he was upright did he look down at Eleanor, still kneeling in street water, hands empty, hair half fallen, hunger and exhaustion written where anyone with eyes could read it. "Stand," he said. She rose, her knees protested, the world tipped once, and righted. He turned to Lady Anderson. "You accused her of theft." "I cautioned you, Your Grace, out of loyalty to your interests." "You described her as unreliable?" "She is a dependent with no discipline." Julian's jaw set, scar whitening near his temple. She crossed a carriage lane while others watched and bled in silk under cover. "She kept my head off a gutter stone." She ordered men twice her size to move when rank froze them in place. "If this is your definition of unreliability, I recommend you revise it." Lady Anderson's colour rose beneath powder. "I did not come here to be lectured in the rain." "No," Julian said. "You came to retrieve a witness." The word fell heavy. Eleanor felt it immediately. Witness, not servant, not burden. Lady Anderson glanced toward the cluster of onlookers, calculating. "Witness to what, precisely?" "To the crash," Julian said. "To the condition of my carriage before impact. To who touched what afterward. To what was said." He shifted his gaze to Eleanor, and his next sentence was an order shaped as protection so blatant she could not pretend not to hear it. "She remains." Lady Anderson took one step forward, silk whispering against wet stone. "Your Grace, she is under my authority." Julian did not move. "Not this morning." Clara found her voice first, brittle with affront. "You cannot simply take people from respectable households." His eyes cut to her once. Clara went still. Imogen tried a softer angle. "Eleanor is not presentable for your house." Julian's gaze returned to Eleanor's face. "I did not request decoration." The surgeon cleared his throat and offered a folded cloth for the remaining blood at Julian's temple. Julian took it without looking. "Harness a spare team," he told his man. "Recover the papers from the road. Seal every trunk. I want inventory taken before noon." "Yes, Your Grace." He faced Eleanor again. Rain had gentled to mist. Her hands had begun to shake harder now that urgency was gone. He noticed, of course he noticed. "You will ride to Blackthorn House," he said. "You will give a formal statement. You will bring that hat box." Lady Anderson opened her mouth. Julian did not look at her when he spoke the final line. "If any person interferes, they answer to me." Lady Anderson's nostrils flared, but she bowed because 20 witnesses were watching, and because the Duke of Blackthorn was standing in rain with blood at his temple and command in every line of his body. "As you wish, your grace," she said. "I would never obstruct justice." The lie was smooth as cream. Eleanor heard Clara draw breath to protest, and heard Imogen silence her with a quick hiss. Julian gave no acknowledgment beyond a slight turn of his head toward his men. 2 footmen moved at once. One lifted the hat box from where Eleanor had left it by the column. The other opened the carriage door of a plain travelling coach that had pulled up behind the wreck. Eleanor stepped toward the box. "If you please, I will carry it." Julian looked at her wet sleeves, her torn hem, her hands reddened raw by rain and rope and cold. "No." His tone permitted nothing further. The footman held the box as if it were porcelain and followed 3 paces behind her toward the waiting coach. Lady Anderson glided close enough that only Eleanor could hear. Lavender and damp silk wrapped around the words. "You will remember where your bed is, girl. 1 foolish sentence and you will not have even that." Eleanor kept her face turned toward the coach. "I sleep in the attic, Lady Anderson. You have reminded me daily." She climbed into the vehicle without waiting for dismissal. Her heart struck hard against her ribs as the door shut, shutting out Lady Anderson's expression and the staring crowd in one blunt motion. She sat on the edge of the squab, spine rigid, water running from her skirt onto polished wood. Opposite her, the hat box rested on the seat like a silent accusation. The Duke's steward, a lean man with iron-grey hair and a scar across one knuckle, took the forward bench near the door and did not speak. Outside, commands cracked through the mist. Harness chains rang. A horse stamped and snorted. The overturned carriage groaned as men levered it upright. When the coach jolted forward, Eleanor braced one hand on the seat and the other over her empty stomach. Hunger had become a trembling thing now that danger had shifted shape. She had stood in rain beside strangers often enough. She had not sat under Blackthorn protection once in 2 years, and even now she could not tell whether that protection would hold after statements were taken and tempers cooled. Men of rank made promises in public and revised them in private. Her father had taught her that too, though more gently. They descended from the crescent and took the west road. Rain softened to a fine drift that blurred the windows and turned Bath to watercolour stone and shadow. On a normal day she would have marked shops, counted turns, memorised names for errands. This morning she counted only breaths and the pulse in her throat. The steward unfolded a notebook and began writing a list in neat columns. Trunks recovered, papers sealed, horses injured, witnesses present. Practical details, measurable facts. She stared at the hat box and tried to remember whether it had always been this heavy. By the time they reached Blackthorn House, the church bells had struck 10. The townhouse rose from the square in dark stone, severe and almost monastic despite its size. No garlands, no bright paint. Iron railings black with rain. The door opened before the coach fully stopped. A butler in sober livery stepped down, took one look at Eleanor's soaked cloak and torn skirt, and did not allow surprise to reach his face. "Miss Anderson," he said, as if her arrival were expected. "This way, if you please." Warmth hit her at once when she crossed the threshold. Not comfort. Heat from banked fires and thick walls and carpets that swallowed sound. Her shoes left wet marks on marble. A maid appeared with towels, another with a tray bearing tea and broth. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall and did not touch either. She had been in grand houses before, mostly as burden and shadow, and she knew the peril of accepting kindness before terms were stated. The butler noticed her hesitation. "His Grace has ordered that you be given dry wraps and food immediately," he said. You may eat while your statement is prepared. Ordered. She could accept an order. She inclined her head. They led her to a small morning room at the rear, panelled in dark wood with shelves of books to the ceiling and a fire burning low. A plain wool shawl waited by the hearth. The maid set broth beside her with hands that shook slightly from curiosity. Eleanor wrapped her fingers around the bowl and let the steam warm her face before she drank. Salt, onion, barley. She had not tasted meat stock in days. She drank too fast, stopped and forced herself to slow. Across from her on a side table, the hat box sat where the footman had placed it. The clasp was still closed. She was lifting the second spoonful when raised voices passed the corridor outside. Lady Anderson's tone carried first, silk over steel. My daughters cannot be expected to linger in this scandalous house while my dependent is interrogated. I will take her statement myself and send it under seal. A man answered, cool and implacable. Not Julian, the steward. His Grace has directed otherwise. You forget to whom you are speaking. No, Lady Anderson, I do not. The voices moved away. Eleanor set the spoon down and stared at the fire. If Lady Anderson had followed them here, then she had not yielded. She had merely changed terrain. A quarter-hour later, the butler returned with writing materials. His Grace will receive your account in the library when you are ready. Eleanor stood, set aside the shawl, and reached for the hat box. The butler moved to carry it. She surprised herself by tightening her grip. I will bring it. He stepped back at once. As you wish, miss. The library door was ajar. She heard no voices inside, only the scrape of a poker in the grate and the soft clink of glass. She entered and found Julian standing by the mantel in a fresh black coat, damp hair combed back, a narrow linen bandage crossing his brow beneath the hairline. He looked larger indoors, more controlled, as if pain had been folded and put away with his wet clothes. A surgeon packed instruments at the far table. Julian did not look at him when he spoke. You are dismissed, Mr. Crowthorne. Your Grace should rest. I gave an order. The surgeon bowed and departed, passing Eleanor with a brief glance at her torn hem and the box in her hands. Julian waited until the door clicked shut. Then he crossed to the desk and sat, one forearm on leather blotter, posture rigid despite what must have been a pounding head. He gestured to the chair opposite. Sit! Give your account from the beginning. Names first. Eleanor sat. The hat box rested against her skirts, heavy and awkward. She recited what she had seen. Rain on cobbles, wheel strike, overturned axle, horse position, timing of the first cries, who approached, who withdrew, who touched his person and who did not. She gave names where she knew them and descriptions where she did not. She did not embellish. She did not soften Lady Anderson's accusation. At one point, Julian interrupted. Repeat her exact words. She said I had a habit of placing myself where I was not wanted. She advised that if anything was missing from your effects, I should be searched before I left the street. His eyes hardened. And did you touch any trunk, case, or pocket belonging to me? No, Your Grace. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds, not because he doubted her, but because he weighed every detail like evidence. Then he nodded once and wrote a line in his own hand at the bottom of the page. Sign. She took the pen. Her fingers left a faint tremor in the ink on the first letter of her surname. She set the pen down. A knock sounded. Before either could answer, the door opened and Lady Anderson entered in travel silk, dry now and composed, Clara and Imogen behind her like pale satellites. The butler appeared instantly at her shoulder. Lady Anderson, he said, voice like polished oak. His Grace did not grant. She will speak now, Lady Anderson said. ignoring him and fixing her gaze on Eleanor. "You have done enough damage for one day." Julian rose. He did not raise his voice. "Get out!" Clara flushed. "How dare—" Julian looked at her once. She stopped. Lady Anderson drew herself taller. "Your Grace, this concerns my family. It concerns perjury in my house. Leave." The room held its breath. Rain tapped the windows. Imogen's gloved hand tightened on her reticule until the clasp clicked. Lady Anderson changed approach with visible effort. "If the girl has spoken rashly, I am prepared to overlook it. She is nervous around authority. She imagines slights. She confuses instruction with cruelty." Eleanor felt something inside her go very still. "I do not confuse them," she said. All three women turned to her, as if a chair had spoken. Eleanor kept her voice low, formal, precise. "Instruction tells a person what must be done. Cruelty tells a person what she is worth. I have received both from your ladyship. I know the difference." Colour rose at Lady Anderson's throat. "You ungrateful child!" Julian moved one step, placing himself between Eleanor and Lady Anderson, without flourish, without touching either. A wall in black wool and controlled violence. "You have had your warning," he said. "Remove yourself now, or I will have you removed." No one in the room mistook the meaning. Lady Anderson's eyes flicked to the open doorway, where two blackthorn footmen now stood at discreet attention. She smiled with all her teeth and none of her warmth. "Very well, we shall do this lawfully." She turned to Eleanor. "Bring the box." Eleanor's hand tightened around the handle. "No!" Lady Anderson's composure cracked for half a heartbeat. "It is mine," Julian answered first. "It is material evidence." Lady Anderson laughed once, thin and disbelieving. "Evidence of what, exactly? Hats and ribbons?" Julian extended his hand toward Eleanor. "Open it." She set the box on the desk between them. The lacquer gleamed darkly. Her fingers worked the clasp. It stuck once, then gave. Inside lay folded tissue, 2 ostrich plumes, a satin cap, and beneath those the expected layers of lace wraps and gloves. Nothing unusual, nothing that justified the weight that had bruised her forearm all morning. "Lift the tray," Julian said. She hesitated. She had never opened it. She had never been invited to touch its contents. Lady Anderson made a small, warning sound. Julian did not look away from Eleanor. "Lift it." She slid her fingers under the inner tray and raised it. Beneath, where no hat should be, lay 2 thick account ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, a leather purse heavy with coin, and a packet of promissory notes bound with blue ribbon. On top sat a signet seal from her father's old office, the one declared lost after his death. For a moment no one spoke. Then Clara whispered, "Mother?" Lady Anderson's face had gone pale beneath powder. "Those are not mine." The words were too quick, too rehearsed for surprise. Eleanor stared at the ledgers and understood the architecture at once. A box she was forced to carry, a public accident, a public accusation of theft, hidden accounts tied to the Anderson debt, found on her person, and a dependent girl with no legal counsel to explain how they came there. Efficient ruin. Imogen recovered first, voice sharp. "She put them there. She has had the box all day." Lady Anderson seized the opening. "Exactly. You see, Your Grace, she is cunning when cornered." Eleanor looked up. Her pulse hammered, but her voice did not break. "No, I am convenient when cornered." Julian's gaze moved from her face to the ledgers, to Lady Anderson, back to Eleanor. "Do you know these books?" "Yes." She swallowed once. "They are from my father's shipping office. The brown volume is quarter ledger for freight insurance. The black is disbursements." "You can verify entries?" "Yes." Lady Anderson stepped forward, hand outstretched. "I demand you return my property at once." Julian closed the hatbox lid with one flat palm. The sound cracked through the room. "Your demand is denied." She drew herself up, silk rustling like dry leaves. "On what authority?" "Mine." Lady Anderson laughed again, but fear threaded it now. "You would take the word of a penniless girl over a widow of standing." Julian's eyes were winter water. "I would take documented figures over perfume and theatre." Eleanor felt the room tilt, not from hunger this time, from the sudden, brutal relief of being believed before she had begged for it. She stood because the sitting felt too much like collapse. "Your Grace, you must summon a magistrate." Every head turned toward her. Lady Anderson stared as if she had struck her. "Have you gone mad?" Eleanor kept her gaze on Julian. "If these are examined privately, it becomes household quarrel and gossip. If they are examined in law, it becomes record. I ask for record." "You understand what testimony requires?" Julian said quietly. "Dates, treatment, financial knowledge, public examination." "Yes." "They will question your character." "They question it now." Lady Anderson's voice dropped to a hiss. "Think very carefully. You have nowhere to go if you do this." Eleanor looked at the woman who had taken her mother's cloak, her books, her meals, her name at table, and finally tried to place theft in her hands. She felt fear, but it was no longer the largest thing in her chest. "I have somewhere to stand," she said. "That is enough." For a beat, the only sound was rain on the panes and the muted clatter of carriage wheels in the square below. Julian did not move. His jaw worked once, scar pulling faintly at his temple. Then he reached for the bell pull and yanked it once, hard. The butler entered immediately. "Send for Magistrate Hale," Julian said. "Now, place these ledgers under seal in my safe. Mr. Fenwick will witness the chain of custody. Lady Anderson and her daughters are to be escorted to their carriage and are not to re-enter this house without written summons." Lady Anderson made a choking sound of outrage. "You cannot!" Julian's voice cut through hers like a blade laid flat. "I just did!" The footman stepped in. Not rough, not hesitant. Clara began to cry from pure shock. Imogen clutched her mother's sleeve and looked at Eleanor with naked hatred. Lady Anderson paused at the threshold and turned back, eyes burning. "This is not finished." Eleanor met her gaze and answered with the calm she had earned one hungry day at a time. "No, Lady Anderson, it has begun." The door closed behind them. Silence dropped, dense and strange. Eleanor's knees weakened all at once. She reached for the desk edge and found it. Julian crossed the space between them in 2 strides, stopped close enough that she felt the heat of him, despite the cold left in her clothes, and issued the next command without softness. "You will sit. You will eat. Then you will prepare your statement for the magistrate." She sat because her legs would not bargain further. A maid appeared as if conjured, setting fresh tea and bread on the side table with eyes carefully lowered. Julian remained standing beside the desk, one hand braced on the wood, head slightly bowed as though the wound at his brow had begun to pound again. He did not ask whether she regretted what she had done. He called for ink, sand, and a second witness copy, and Eleanor took up the pen with steady fingers. Ink scratched across laid paper in a steady, deliberate line, while the fire settled behind the grate with small, collapsing sighs. Eleanor wrote the date first, then her name in full, then the sequence exactly as it had occurred on the crescent stones. The snap of timber, the horse down on the near side, the angle of the carriage before it turned. Julian stood at the far edge of the desk, one hand braced against carved oak, watching each line as if words themselves might attempt to escape. He did not interrupt unless a phrase lacked precision. "Replace many people with names," he said. She dipped the pen again. "I knew only 2. "Then describe the others by trade and position." She obeyed. Grocer's clerk in brown coat, coachman with scar at left cheek, lady under blue umbrella beside the milliner's cart. No embroidery, no appeal, facts only. Her fingers cramped by the second page. She flexed them once and continued. By the time the mantel clock marked 10:30, the butler returned with Mr. Fenwick, the steward, and a brass dispatch case. Fenwick carried the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and tied with fresh twine, his expression severe with duty and an older, quieter anger on her behalf. Julian broke his own signet wax over the knots, pressed the blackthorn crest into each seal, and dated the margins in his narrow hand. Then he passed one ledger to Fenwick and kept the other at his elbow. "Chain of custody," he said. Fenwick nodded. "Witnessed." Eleanor finished the 3rd page and sanded it. When she looked up, she found Julian still where he had been, still as carved stone, bandaged stark against his dark hair. Most men shifted when pain pressed at their skull. He did not. Control held him upright by force. A knock sounded once. The butler opened the door and announced, "Magistrate Hale." The magistrate entered in a rain-dark coat, hat under one arm, boots wet at the seams. He was broad in the middle, silver at the temples, and carried the wary patience of a man who had heard too many liars speak first, and too many truths arrive late. He bowed to Julian, then to Eleanor, not deeply, but with full acknowledgment. "Your Grace, Miss Anderson, I came at once." Julian gestured toward the desk. "We have statements and books. Sit." Hale sat. He removed gloves finger by finger and laid them beside his notebook. His eyes moved to Eleanor's torn hem, the raw skin over her knuckles, the half-empty broth bowl on the side table. Nothing in his face shifted, but he had seen enough to begin arranging the shape of this case before a word was spoken. "Miss Anderson," he said, "I will hear your account from your own mouth. Speak slowly. If you do not know a thing, say you do not know it." She folded her hands to hide their tremor and repeated everything. The road, the crash, the accusation, the contents of the hat box, her father's office seal. She did not look at Julian while she spoke. She fixed her gaze on the magistrate's ink-stained cuff and held herself inside the discipline her father taught her. Figures first, fear later. Hale asked careful, narrowing questions. Who had continuous possession of the box from morning until opening? "I carried it throughout the morning and the journey by Lady Anderson's order. From the Crescent into this house, a Blackthorn footman carried it under staff control in my sight." "Did you open it at any point before this room?" "No." "Did anyone else touch it in your sight?" "That same Blackthorn footman carried it from the Crescent into this house. He did not open it." "Name?" "I do not know his name." Fenwick supplied it from the doorway. "Mason," Hale wrote. "Could the ledgers have been placed before this morning?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I was not permitted to open it at any stage of travel." Julian spoke then, voice clipped. "Lady Anderson instructed that specifically." Hale looked up. "You heard this?" "I heard Miss Anderson confirm it in public before witnesses." The magistrate turned one page back. "Miss Anderson, you stated the brown ledger is freight insurance quarter account. On what basis do you identify it?" She met his gaze fully. "I assisted my father in copying quarterly summaries from age 12. The cover stain at lower spine is lamp oil from October 2 years ago. The broken clasp was mended with wire by Mr. Dorr, our clerk. The first inner page should carry Anderson and Fell shipping, quarter Michaelmas, in my father's hand." Hale untied the wrapping with deliberate care, opened to the first page, and read. A long silence followed. He traced the heading once with his thumb and nodded to himself. "Accurate," he said. He opened the black ledger next. Disbursement columns. Debts transferred. Payments marked pending, then struck through. Several entries were overwritten. A few had initials that did not match the elder Anderson's script. Hale's mouth thinned. "Your Grace, these volumes require formal examination." "They will have it," Julian said. Hale closed the book and retied the knot. "Miss Anderson, if this proceeds to hearing, counsel for Lady Anderson may attack your reliability, your memory, and your motives. They may suggest revenge." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten, but kept her voice level. "My motive is that numbers remain numbers after rooms are empty." For the first time, something like respect moved across Hale's face. He dipped his pen and wrote one line with care. A servant appeared at the door carrying a salver. "A note from Lady Anderson, delivered by her coachman, marked urgent." Julian held out his hand. He read the folded sheet once, expression unchanged, then passed it to Hale. The magistrate scanned it and exhaled through his nose. "She requests immediate return of personal millinery property and alleges unlawful seizure," Hale said. Julian took the note back and laid it beside the fire with the tongs resting on top so it would not curl closed. "Record her protest. Deny her request." Hale nodded. "Done." No thread was left hanging. A message sent. A response entered into law. By 11 o'clock the formal deposition was complete. Hale sanded signatures, blotted and sealed duplicate copies. He assigned an officer to collect sworn witness statements from the Crescent. He named where the ledgers would be examined and by whom. Every action became record. Every record narrowed the space where Lady Anderson could improvise. Then he closed his notebook and looked between Julian and Eleanor. "One immediate matter remains," he said. "Miss Anderson should not return to Lady Anderson's house before preliminary review. That household is now materially implicated. Pressure upon a key witness would be presumed." Eleanor's breath caught before she could master it. Habit answered first. "I have no legal residence apart from that address." Hale turned to Julian. "Your Grace." Julian did not hesitate. "She stays here." Hale studied him, then gave one short nod. "Suitable. I will include protective lodging under your surety until first hearing." He rose. Julian rose with him despite the pull of pain that crossed his face, and vanished almost instantly. Men in power often sat, while others bowed. He stood anyway, and that detail lodged in Eleanor's chest where gratitude had become dangerous. At the threshold, Hale paused beside her chair. "Miss Anderson, keep your timeline exact." "Dates are armour." She inclined her head. "Yes, sir." When the door shut behind him, the room fell quiet except for rain against the panes and the faint hiss from the fire where one drop had found the chimney draught. Fenwick collected sealed packets and withdrew. The butler closed the door. They were alone. Eleanor reached for the edge of the desk to stand and found the room tilting slightly to the left. Hunger, adrenaline, and hours of held posture converged without warning. She steadied herself before it became visible. It became visible anyway. "Sit," Julian said. "I am well." "Sit." The command landed with no raised volume, no threat, and no space for pride. She sat. Her pulse beat at her throat, hard and uneven. Across from her, Julian moved around the desk, took the chair opposite, and for the first time since the crash allowed his shoulders to lower by a fraction. He watched her with the same relentless attention he had given the ledgers. "You are near collapse," he said. "I have endured worse." "I know." 2 words. Flat. Irreversible. She looked up quickly. "No, what?" His jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he would refuse the answer. Then he spoke as if reciting evidence before court. "I know you were sent on foot in rain while your family rode behind glass. I know you settled accounts in 3 towns this week and 8 standing near stables. I know your left shoe takes water through the seam. I know Lady Anderson keeps you visible when she wants obedience displayed and invisible when she wants sympathy purchased. I know the bruise at your wrist is not recent. I know you flinch before she touches you, even when she only adjusts your sleeve for an audience." Each sentence struck like a nail driven cleanly. No ornament, no evasion. Care, in the only language he seemed able to trust. She could not answer at once. Heat rose behind her eyes and she hated it. She had not wept in front of Lady Anderson for years. She would not begin now in a duke's library, because he had chosen accuracy over politeness. "How long?" she asked finally, voice rougher than she intended. "Have you been observing me?" "Since Bristol Road," she stared. "That was 5 days." "My carriage crossed yours twice. My men reported the rest." "Why?" A long pause. Rain thickened at the window, then softened again. "Because your father wrote to me before he died," Julian said. "Because I was not here to answer." The wound in his brow seemed suddenly deeper than linen and skin. She remembered the rumours of his death, the 2 absent years, the bitter arithmetic that followed. A man could return from the sea and still arrive too late for what mattered. She folded her hands tighter. "You could not have prevented fever." "I could have prevented what followed." Evidence suggested otherwise. Pride suggested silence. Weariness made her honest. "You do not owe me rescue for old friendship." He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, gaze fixed on her face. "This is not rescue. Then what is it?" His answer came without softness and with more weight than tenderness might have carried. "Recognition." The word hung between them, stark as judgment and far more intimate. She felt the old split inside her narrow, not healed, not gone, narrowed enough to breathe through. Still she held one last defence. "Recognition can resemble pity when spoken by men with houses." His mouth moved once, that near smile that never became one. "Pity looks away, I do not." He proved it by doing exactly that, not moving, not reaching, not pretending ease. He sat across from her and bore witness to the full, unbeautiful truth of her condition, without disguising it under gentility. Minutes passed. He remained. The library clock ticked through each one like a metronome for endurance. At last he rose, crossed to the bell-pull and rang once. The butler entered. "Prepare the south attic suite for Miss Anderson," Julian said. "Not the guest wing. The room's above the nursery corridor. She is to have a lock changed today. Mrs. Davies will attend her. Meals regular, not requested. No note or messenger from Lady Anderson reaches her unexamined. If anyone from that household attempts entry, they are refused at the door and reported to Mr. Fenwick and to me at once." "Very good, Your Grace. Also," Julian said, "send for a cobbler, 2 pairs, and gloves." The butler inclined his head and withdrew. Eleanor stood slowly this time, steadier now, though every muscle felt borrowed. "You assign me as if I was staff," he faced her squarely. "I assign protection because debate wastes time." Her chin lifted. "I'm not a ward." "No," he said. "You are a principal witness and Mr. Anderson's daughter." There it was again. Not burden, not dependent. A name returned to her in full. She drew breath to answer, and the door opened without knock. A small boy of about 7 stood there in nightshirt and wool robe, hair disordered from sleep, one fist rubbing at his eye. He looked from Julian to Eleanor, uncertain, then stepped 2 paces inside and stopped. "Uncle Jules," he said quietly. Mrs. Davies says the thunder is gone. Is it true? Julian turned at once, and something in his face altered so briefly Eleanor might have missed it if she had not been watching for fractures all morning. The hard line around his mouth loosened. Not warmth exactly. Permission for warmth. "It is true, Thomas," he said. "Come here." The boy came, saw Eleanor's torn skirt and ink-stained fingers, and gave a solemn half-bow, learned by repetition. "Good morning, miss." "Good morning, Master Thomas." He looked at the bandage on Julian's brow. "Does it hurt?" Julian's hand settled lightly on the boy's shoulder. He did not answer the question. Instead, he looked at Eleanor over the child's head, and the silence itself became answer enough for both of them. Thomas leaned in against his uncle's coat, already half asleep where he stood. Julian did not shift him away. He remained standing in the centre of the room, with one hand at the boy's shoulder and the other hanging at his side, still as a man holding a line against weather. Eleanor gathered her pages into a neat stack and set them on the desk. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and formal. "Where shall I go now, Your Grace?" His gaze stayed on her a long moment. "Nowhere," he said. "You are home until the law is finished." The word struck deeper than command. She had no defence left for it, and perhaps no desire to build one. Outside, rain moved over the square in silver veils. Inside, under dark beams and watchful firelight, Eleanor stood with ink on her fingers and her name restored to record, while the Duke of Blackthorn held his ground and kept his gaze on hers. A hard knock struck the library door, and Fenwick entered with rain on his shoulders and an officer at his back in magistrate blue. "Your Grace," Fenwick said, breath controlled but urgent, "Mr. Hale has sent preliminary witness returns from the Crescent. He requests Miss Anderson present at noon in chambers. Lady Anderson has attempted to remove records from Anderson House this hour." Julian's hand tightened once on the chair back. "Did she succeed?" "No, Your Grace," the officer said. "We sealed the office door and posted men." Eleanor felt the old cold move through her ribs, then settle into something steadier than fear. "I will attend," she said. At noon the rain had thinned to a grey mist that clung to coats and lashes, and Magistrate Hale's chambers smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and coal smoke. The room was already full when Eleanor entered beside Fenwick and Mrs. Davies, with Julian one pace behind and slightly to her left, not touching her, not leaving space for anyone to crowd her either. Lady Anderson sat at the opposite table, in dove silk and pearls, composed to the edge of fracture. Clara stared at her folded gloves. Imogen held her chin high and looked at Eleanor as if contempt might still function as law. On Hale's table lay every object that had once been hidden or disputed: the hat box, now open and empty, the 2 ledgers under broken court seals, the leather purse, the packet of promissory notes bound in blue ribbon, Mr. Anderson's office seal wrapped in cloth, Eleanor's signed statement, Julian's witness copy, and 3 fresh depositions from men on the Crescent. No thread had vanished in private. Everything sat under light. Hale called the room to order and began without preamble. He read first from the witness statements. The grocer's clerk confirmed Lady Anderson had publicly named Eleanor a likely thief before the box was opened. The coachman with the scar confirmed Lady Anderson had instructed Eleanor not to open the hat box at any stage of travel. The milliner's assistant confirmed she saw Lady Anderson's maid carry that same box alone from private parlour to carriage before dawn. Lady Anderson's counsel rose to object. Hale lifted one hand. "Your objection is noted. Sit." He then summoned Mr. Dorr, the Anderson shipping clerk, a narrow man with ink on his cuffs and grief carved into the corners of his mouth. He bowed toward Eleanor before he faced the magistrate. "Do you recognise these ledgers?" Hale asked. I do, sir. Mr. Anderson's quarter books. I balanced against them each month. Do you recognise this hand? Hale turned the volume. Dorr leaned in, swallowed and nodded. The original entries are Mr. Anderson's. The overwrites are not. Several disbursement lines were altered after his death. Altered to what end? Dorr glanced once toward Lady Anderson and then back to the page. To show debt expansion larger than true liability? To justify liquidation of remainder estate property? To convert restricted funds into discretionary household account? Whose household account? Dorr answered softly, but every person heard it. Lady Anderson's. Imogen made a sharp sound under her breath. Clara shut her eyes. Lady Anderson did not move. Hale held up the office seal wrapped in linen. Mr. Dorr, was this seal ever formally transferred? No, sir. It was reported missing. Eleanor watched Hale compare wax impressions on the promissory notes to the recovered seal. The ridge breaks matched. The lower serif was chipped exactly as her father once cursed when a clerk dropped it. Hale set both down with careful finality. Julian spoke only once during the evidentiary hour, and when he did, the room went still. Enter into record, he said, that these materials were discovered concealed beneath millinery in a hat box carried under compulsion by Miss Anderson and produced by her without coercion in my library, in the presence of 3 witnesses. Entered, Hale said. Lady Anderson finally rose. This is absurd. A dead man's disorder is being draped on my shoulders because a girl seeks elevation through scandal. Eleanor stood before she consciously chose to stand. Her palms were damp. Her voice was level. My father's disorder did not write over his own hand after burial. Lady Anderson's eyes flashed. You ungrateful! Hale struck the table once with his palm. Enough! You will address this court, not each other. He read his interim ruling in a measured tone that admitted no theatre. Lady Anderson was censured for fraudulent control practices pending full civil adjudication. She was removed immediately from financial authority over the Anderson remainder estate. Control reverted to a protected trust administered by the court, with Miss Eleanor Anderson as principal beneficiary and decision party of age. All household books were to be seized. All staff testimony would be taken under oath. Lady Anderson was ordered to vacate Anderson House within 24 hours and forbidden direct contact with Miss Anderson, except through legal petition. The words did not arrive as triumph. They arrived as structure, stone underfoot where mud had been. Imogen stood so quickly her chair scraped. You cannot turn us into beggars because of her. Hale did not look up from the order he signed. You are not beggars, Miss Imogen. You are adults asked to live within lawful means. Clara looked at Eleanor then, and for the first time there was no bright malice in her face, only naked fear and the shock of a world that had stopped arranging itself around her comfort. It paid nothing back, that look, and Eleanor noted it as one note's weather. Clara had never revealed anything useful because there had been nothing in her to reveal but compliance. When Hale passed down the sealed order, 2 court officers stepped to Lady Anderson's side. She remained seated for one long moment, then rose with every inch of dignity she could still purchase. She turned to Eleanor at the door. You think this is victory. It is merely exposure. Eleanor met her eyes. Exposure is all I asked. The next morning at Anderson House, the front hall smelled of lavender and old smoke and damp plaster, exactly as it had on every winter dawn of her endurance. Only the arrangement had changed. Officers stood by the staircase. Fenwick supervised inventory beside the long table where her father once sorted port invoices. Mrs. Davies waited near the door with a quiet, watchful face. Lady Anderson descended in travelling silk with Clara and Imogen behind her, 3 trunks tagged for departure. No one shouted, no one touched. Law moved in clipped instructions and signatures. Hale's clerk read each seized item aloud as it was boxed. 2 altered ledgers, 1 purse of mixed sovereigns and notes, 1 packet of promissory documents, 1 recovered Anderson office seal, 1 set of household account books, 1 correspondence bundle marked private. Each item received a docket number and destination. Eleanor signed as observing party. Fenwick countersigned. Nothing disappeared into private pockets again. On the landing, Clara paused and looked toward the upstairs passage, where Eleanor's mother's portrait had hung in exile. "I did not know about the books," she said, voice thin. "Mother said you invented deficits for attention." Eleanor held the stair rail and answered with no cruelty and no rescue. "Then you should have asked me once." Clara lowered her gaze and followed her mother out. Imogen did not speak at all. When the door closed behind the carriage that took them away, the house changed by a degree too small for anyone else to name. Fewer commands in the walls, more air in the corridor. Mrs. Davies crossed to Eleanor and placed a ring of old brass keys in her hand, heavy and warm from her palm. "Your mother kept these," she said. "I held them after the funeral. I was waiting for the proper day." Eleanor closed her fingers over the metal until the edges pressed her skin. "Thank you." By late afternoon she stood in Blackthorn's library, again, cleaned, fed and dressed in a plain dark gown that fit her shoulders and did not smell of another woman's perfume. Julian waited at the window, profile cut against pale light, hands clasped behind his back to keep them still. The bandage at his brow was gone. The cut had narrowed to a red line. "The legal order is executed," he said. "Hale confirms full hearing will formalise what was entered today." She nodded. "Then the house is no longer a trap." "No." Silence held for a beat. He turned from the window and faced her squarely. "I will not insult you with urgency," he said. "I intend to court you, if you permit it, publicly, properly, without barter." The crux sat between them, clean and non-trivial. She had been commanded for years under the language of necessity. She would not step into another form of obedience disguised as gratitude. "My terms are simple," she said. "No marriage while proceedings remain open. No transfer of my restored property into your control. No decisions about my household without my consent. If you are angered, you will speak, not issue silence as punishment." His gaze did not flicker. "Accepted." She studied him, waiting for the correction men often added after agreement. None came. "And one more," she said. "You will not call what happened to me misfortune. Name it when you see it." His jaw set, then eased. "Cruelty." "Yes." He took one step closer, then stopped, leaving space she could cross or refuse. "Will you allow courtship, Eleanor Anderson?" She felt the keys in her pocket, the weight of her own name restored in court record, the ache of old grief altered but not erased. "Yes," she said, "on those terms." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, and he inclined his head as if receiving a solemn oath. That evening, as rain finally cleared and the first dry wind moved over Bath, a footman announced that Magistrate Hale's final receipt had arrived. All seized items lodged, all statements entered, Lady Anderson's petition for immediate reversal denied. Julian handed the receipt to Eleanor without opening it first. She read every line, sanded the acknowledgement, and sealed it herself with her father's recovered office mark, now entered lawfully to her hand. When she looked up, Julian was watching her with that unyielding, exact attention that had first felt like threat and now felt like witness. "Good," he said. "Good because the record held. Good because no item was missing. Good, because power had finally been required to answer to fact. She set the seal down beside the lamp, and this time she did not lower her eyes.